Order, everybody. Welcome to the Children's Ground webinar in respect of Invasion Day. This is a webinar we generally hold every year to talk about issues that are important for us and important for First Nations people. Today on the panel, we'll be talking about agency and self-determination. It's a really short webinar. We're hoping to see it as a bit of a taster going forward on issues that affect First Nations people. And one of the issues that we want to talk about today is First Nations education and how important that is for us and also for our children moving forward. Firstly, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we all gather today. It is important to remember and acknowledge the Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander peoples who have gone before me. They are the ones who have fought hard to maintain our Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination over many thousands of years. Traditional owners and my elders have kept these values and actions strong amongst our mobs so that we can live a true and honest reflection of where we come from and where we want to be in the future. I also want to acknowledge the other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today, and particularly those on the panel that we have. So just to firstly introduce everybody, in Bukanala, which has got the same name as me, it's just the way it's turned out, is Charisse Buzzicott, Veronica Turner and Mundagori. And we also have the Associate Professor of Batchelor Institute, Kathryn Gilbey. And we're also hoping that another person can join us. They're just having glitches with their IT at the moment. Auntie Steph Armstrong is also an educator and teacher. I think what we'd also like to engage with and have in this discussion is some thoughts around or any questions that you might like to share about what we're talking about today. And hopefully, if you've got any, please just put them in the chat and then we can go from there. Yes, what I'd like to do is firstly start off with a question for everybody. Hi, Auntie Steph.
Back.
I've just introduced everybody, and I'm just about to ask the first question of everybody. So just to start off with, I'm just really interested to hear from all of you about what you think a First Nations education system should look like to you. What are you actually practicing or undertaking in your areas in regards to First Nations education? And what are the parts of that education system that are the most important to you or the most significant to you? And they may all be important, but I'm really interested to know what does that First Nations education system look like to you? So I'll go to Charisse and Veronica and Munda first and just ask your thoughts on that question.
Hello.
Hello.
What up? Arrernte Veronica, what I turn when they barn planama, Bacanal of water as a co-director and Arrernte language speaker. First of all, like to really people here in the spring, Mparntwe, from the people. Why is it important for our teaching
education of our children, Veronica?
Education for our children is that because some of our children has failed in the Western education. That's why we have children's grant, because children's grants for every opportunity for them, so we can teach in our way, in our language, in our own country, because they will be running around free, where they can go, where they can look, where they can listen to, and everything that comes from the land is from a parent. That's where our education starts from. from the land.
Thank you.
So yeah, just for me, you know, having a First Nations-led education system is about having a First Nation system that's designed, it's programmed around and centers around our culture and our language. And one of the biggest things about us is about, you know, strengthening and revitalizing our own knowledge and language and our history and our connection to country. And a big part of it is, you know, empowering our First Nations leaders to be educators, because we're all educators in our own right. We all participate in the learning and education of our families. You know, we really need to implement a system that upholds cultural standards and provides resources to establish our own learning system. So we have a learning knowledge system that's lived for 65,000 plus years. You know, why are we not continuing to have that system? And that comes through the engagement of First Nations educators and leaders.
A guest appearance, Charisse.
Yeah, he's meant to come at the end and do a little sing-song at the end, but
excellent.
I think the main thing that stand out for me is like the holistic approach, you know, and being on country, you know, you can't, almost like you can't divorce, you know, the land from the language, you know, the language lives in the land. And so as an example, if you were to talk about an animal or an animal's anatomy, you know, when you're hunting or something, and you know, you can't sit in a classroom and explain all these joints and all where to cut, or, you know, or even describe something on an animal that isn't in front of you. And so you have to see it, you have to, you know, hear it, you have to be out on country to fully understand. And, you know, some words don't exist in classrooms or wouldn't suit in a classroom. Like, you can't explain words that you could just point to when you're out on country. And so, you know, the best learning happens on country, because you can see it, smell it, touch it, feel it, you know, you can, yeah, all of that.
Thank you. Honey, Steph?
Yeah, I mean, and for me, and it's just an example of it, is that something of joy. Do you know what I mean? Seeing the young fellow just jump in the back, you know, like a First Nations language system is you're going to hear things that are different. So like you're saying, you'll hear the language that's different, but also that you'll hear that laughter, you know, like, which you don't, if you're in a lot of schools, that there's this silence, or it sounds different, you know, and it'll smell different, won't it? You know, because we're all from different countries, and so being on country will give that thing of using those other senses that often, once you're in a classroom, all those other things go, you know. So you're not allowed to, you know, there isn't that big joy, whereas country gives you that joy. And then, so if it's about that thing about spirit, you know, that's when you're in country, you feel that. So that all those other, I think for me, it's all those other emotions that is allowed through a First Nation system, that, you know, spirit, all that social emotional well-being all comes into a First Nations education, and love, because we love our children so deeply, and country loves us so deeply. That will show, you know, which doesn't when you're in the four walls of a classroom. Yeah.
Thanks, Honey, Steph. Kathryn?
Yeah, I agree with everything, and that's why I kind of agreed to do this talk too, because what Children's Ground is proposing doesn't exist in what, you know, we call the First Nations education sector. It exists at home, but it doesn't exist as a named thing, because you don't get to learn the colours of the hole that the goanna digs in a classroom. You can't learn the gradient to go old hole, new hole. You can't learn that in a classroom. You can't learn where to cut up, how to split the porcupine in 4 perfect pieces. But it's more than just learning how to do. As is it in this report, I love this report so much, I quote it all the time, because it's learning how to be. And you don't learn that in a classroom necessarily. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have classrooms, I'm saying we should have both. Because in the classroom, you learn how to be in a very Western way. You learn how to read the cues of the teacher. You learn how to, you know, to be a good student, and it's very competitive. It's a competitive education system. Whereas First Nations education system isn't competitive like that. You don't get, you don't get wrapped over the knuckles for not getting it right the first time. No one's judging you for not getting it right the first time. So I think there's like multi-layers to like what is a First Nations education system. And I think a lot of people have been fighting for a long time to get Aboriginal knowledges recognised within Western education systems. And I will never denigrate that process either. Like a lot of people have been fighting for a long time. And that's really important. It's really important that there are different knowledges represented in the classroom, but it's also really important that students have access, that our kids have access to a different kind of learning as well. And that's how you get to be, you don't just get access to one. When you just get access to one kind, you're being trained to be one kind of person. And you either succeed or fail at that. This is a whole different thing. And this report and the call out that's happening, it sits outside of Western education systems. I think we need both. I think we need to fight constantly for representation within Western education systems, so it's not just one way. But we also need to have a whole system that sits outside of it too.
And can I just add something onto what Kathryn's saying? But it's actually our right. It's actually our human right as Indigenous people, as First Nations people. It's part of the United Nations Declaration that we will have access, and our children will have access to learning and education that's in our language, that is of our doing, that's of our control. So that is actually our right as First Nations people. So we should have a system that is designed for us, that our children can freely access and go between the two systems if that's what we choose to do for our kids. So I just wanted to say very strongly that that's a big focus of our work around the education and developing, with the Chereppunpa, with the Educators First Nations Forum, is like we focus on what are our rights as First Nations people, and that's a big one of it is that we should be able to learn in our own language.
And Australia had signed to that convention, but never adheres to it.
No, no, because it doesn't suit them at certain times. So people are asking in the chat about what report we're referring to, and I'll let you know that it's on our Children's Ground website. If you go on the website and look up the MK Turner report, it is a lovely report that was produced in July last year. We launched it at our Chereppunpa, which is our First Nations Education Network forum in July. It was written in collaboration with Children's Ground and Chereppunpa, and from the workings of Dr. MK Turner, who passed just before the report was released, but was very aware of what was being written and put together, because a lot of that is her work, is what she has done for over 70 years. So that is where that report is available. You can have a look at that. We're off to Canberra in February to launch that report in Parliament House. So we're very pleased to be able to do that as well. And that is why these conversations over the next couple of months will be very much about the report, but also about our right to have a First Nations education system that is written by us, for us, with us, and also that takes into account the Western learning that Kathryn and others have talked about as well. We need to learn both ways. Our kids need to learn both ways. But as Kathryn mentioned, for our kids to be, then we need them also to have that opportunity to have a First Nations education system. Veronica, would you kindly read a page from the report that your mother wrote in Arrernte for me, please? The Arrernte and English translation as well. Could you read that out for me?
Kaljalantama, teaching is really sacred thing. Kaljaranak, constantly learning. Arrernte, seeing it as forever ongoing. Imanak, being shown constantly, continuously. That is how it was and is.
It's the first part of the report, and it talks very much about the sacredness of learning and teaching and education for First Nations people. Veronica and Charisse and Munda, can you tell me and the panel and the people today that are watching what this means to Arrernte people, and why it is important in learning and education and knowledge systems, why we have this sacredness around teaching?
I think for me, and as someone who, a mother, I've got kids who, they're learning in that Western way. They're in the Western schooling system. They're learning English and learning to read and write, but they're asking questions about their identity, about who they are and where they come from. And this is only something that they can learn through family and through their elders. And so for me, it's important to have an opportunity for my kids to have an opportunity to participate in learning culture, because culture is at the very heart of us. It forms our identity. It's how we relate to each other. When I walk down the street, it tells me who I can interact with and who I need to avoid. And those are the sorts of things that, we live in a society that is now, glorifying and like it's uplifting Aboriginal culture in a way that they can, make money from it. But for us, this is our well-being. This is, identifies who we are. And so for me, it's important about, having it constantly learning, and it's constantly ongoing, because that's the way that our stories transfer. If we're not able to retell a story, then that story ends with us. Then that's our whole history, our whole life, and our whole future, because our culture also determines our future on who the person that we will be. It determines where we will go, where we'll travel, and where we'll settle. So that's, for me, just as a First Nations person, I feel, that this is something that's ongoing and it needs to be enacted. Like, otherwise there's no moving forward, because there's no acknowledgement for me as a First Nations person in this country.
And also, if we can keep teaching our law and culture, if we don't have this pathway, our languages will disappear and our laws will be weakened, and also all our children will be lost, because that's why we have to have this strength and knowledge even for our younger ones who are being as a children's grant, able to learn and pass on. This is our future. We have to keep it strong for our kids' sake.
Definitely.
When I look at the quotes that my MK did, about teaching is a sacred thing, I think about the intergenerational learning, like how the children, children are sacred, children are, for example, in the learning, intergenerational, children get the best of everyone, like, as an example for myself, like I don't, sometimes, like, I try to tutor my, one of my daughters some extra stuff because they were a bit behind, and I didn't have the patience for that, and the good thing was that my mum did, or, so I think they can take the best of everyone. And when we go out bush, like, I might get my cousin brothers to, there's things that they can speak to that the kids engage with them differently. And so I really think that that intergenerational learning is really important.
And it's complex. Our kids are very, now because of, my granddaughter is Kamilaroi and Filipino and Scottish. And so, culturally, she's a diverse child, but she very strongly identifies as Aboriginal. She'll tell you in language what that means to her, and that she is a butterfly, and that this is what her response, and she's 8. So very different conversations from an 8-year-old. And she'll tell you about that sacredness of that butterfly. And where her story comes, when a mother paints the story of the butterfly, the balabala, she'll be going, that's me. So her world is much bigger, like, I think that's what this education allows us to think, that all that knowledge and power and wisdom that we have in this country is allowed to be seen and grow. At the moment, we're squashed in that and we're not heard. So for me, a system like this will be about country, will be about elders, will be about language. And you've just heard why the importance of language, you can't explain country without the language from that country, and you can't see the brightness of those words. Like, really using English really minimalizes the colour in our country, I think, in some ways. I know I'm using a bit of acronyms, but that's what it means, that, you know, and that joy is pushed into something a bit smaller. So our way, and I know the women up there said to me about, you know, it really, you know, learning and that lifelong learning goes on and is much bigger than four walls. And, you know, that's what I was sort of learning from them up there. And I totally agree with it. So it's those sort of things, and very much that wholeness. You know, how you were sort of saying before, Amanda, but, you know, this learning is a whole learning, you know, it's that circle learning, and it goes around and it continues. And everyone has a value in that learning too, from the very young who can teach you something, you know, they'll look down at a little ant and show you his things, which we probably might step up and move away from. Yeah.
Thanks, Auntie Steph. Kathryn, as an Associate Professor of the Higher Education Academy, I know you've been working on weaving sections of the MK Turner report into a statement from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium. Can you tell us why this is really important and what it will achieve, you know, putting this work into a higher education space?
Well, that's just one that I've written it into. I've made it into almost everything, because as practitioners, you know, the opening page of the report, and then you turn the page and it says it right there. Teaching is a really sacred thing. And as practitioners in the classroom, as people who are mothers and grandmothers and fathers and grandparents, you know, we all need to remember that this this knowledge exchange is a really sacred thing. So I don't need to talk about the higher education sector so much, like, because it's bigger than that. So I'll give you an example. So Batchelor sits as an Aboriginal organisation within the Western structure. So we were created by non-Aboriginal people, but created for Aboriginal people. So we grew out of like a kind of the Papua New Guinean missionary model. So we sit as very different from the mainstream, but within the mainstream, what this report and what Children's Ground are doing are saying, that's okay over there. And, you know, but what about if we actually really recognize the oldest system of education? What about, like Manda said, if you don't have to choose between being employed and being educated in a First Nations way? What about if there was a sweeping reform that saw, like Charisse was saying, this is our right. It's our right to be able to choose. So this kind of reform agenda is about recognizing both and. So there are spaces for Western academia, absolutely. If you want to go and be a doctor, you need to go and learn how to be a doctor. You need to count the measurements, the medicine, everything like that. If you want to go and be a teacher, you have to go and, you know, do your education degree and get your ATAR and enter into that space. A place like Batchelor provides a softer entry into that space. But what we're talking about here is if you already are a teacher, you're sharing your knowledge, you don't have to do a lesson plan to be able to impart to your children and grandchildren what it is to be in this world and how it is to be a good person. Because this report also talks about the responsibility that is attached to receiving this knowledge. It's not just about the knowledge and the knower exchange like it is in Western Academy. There's a responsibility attached to it. And that is what it is to be. And so I think it's bigger than, I think this kind of push is bigger. Veronica, can I just tell one story?
Yeah.
About your mother?
Yeah.
So I invited Arnie to come and do a talk. I was running the graduate school. So we had like masters and PhD students, and they always, you know, in their journey, they always halfway want to give up. Do you know what I mean? And I say, no, come and listen to this old lady's story, because she will tell you it took her years to write that book. She is like the literal personification of hard work and dedication. and commitment to telling your truth. And so I get her to come in and talk to the masters and PhD students. And, you know, it was maybe like 10 years ago when we were still out at Bloomfield. You know, she came down and we were having kangaroo tail and sweet potato and, you know, and I was just doing everything by myself. I was just being a hero, like a total hero, running around being so important. So, oh my God, I'm so, you know. And Annie just pulled me up and she's like, and she started to do this, to tell me who this person was. And I was like, I don't know, you know, but she wouldn't let me go. She wouldn't let me go until I'd sat down and she switched into Alyawarre. Then she switched into baby talk Alyawarre. So I could, because I couldn't hear. And she wouldn't let me, you know, everyone else was waiting and she just kept making the point. And then my heart rate slowed down. And then I stopped and I just lost all of my, you know, I'm so busy, self-importance. And then I started to really listen to her. And then I was like, and she wouldn't let me go until I'd responded appropriately in Alyawarre to her. And then I was like, oh yeah, Kala, like, and then she was like, because then I'd stopped and I'd stopped. I'd listened. I was listening. And then she said, where are your helpers? After I'd, you know, gotten over all of the bullshit that was attached to running a masterclass, she said, where are your helpers? And I was like, yeah. I mean, Jesse's at soccer and I asked Shirley, but I hadn't done it right. I hadn't done it properly. So she didn't need to give me a big, long lecture about trying to be a hero in the world and not having to do things, trying to do things outside of my community. She didn't need to say that, because what I've never, from that day to this day, and I never, ever will again, ask anyone to do anything for love when we have resources. And I will never, ever try and run a workshop like that on my own, because it's not for me to do that. I always bring in other people to cook the kangaroo tails. And she didn't have to lecture me about that. She didn't have to, you know, go on and plan it. All she said to me was like, stop and listen to me to start with, because you're being silly. She didn't even need to say that. She said, where are your helpers? And I was like, and never again have I ever thought to do something so important outside of, you know, calling on my community to help me, because none of us are lone rangers. And so the lessons that I learned in that interaction, you know, have changed the way that I practice my practice into the future. And they weren't, you know, lessons that I learned in a classroom. They weren't lessons that I learned on a chalkboard, or they were lessons that she was teaching me just by saying, you need to stop it now. You need to slow down and you need to stop being a hero, without saying any of those words to me. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of education system. That's the kind of, you know, this report reflects a lot of it. Teaching is a really sacred thing. And that's the kind of education that we're talking about that sits outside of a Western model. So even though I was asking her to be there because she was telling her story about writing that book, and they're all writing their books and their theses, it didn't matter, because it was me that needed the learning, and it didn't, and I did. Took me a little minute, but I got the lesson. Do you know what I mean? I had to stop. And that's the kind of education that we're talking about that sits outside of these structures. So I won't go on about higher education. That's another webinar. We're talking about this now, and this is a different thing.
Thanks, Kathryn. Everybody, we've gone over time, but you know, I just wanted to say thank you very much for your insights. The book that Kathryn referred to, that Dr. MK wrote, is What It Means to Be an Aboriginal Person. It's available through Kangaroo Press. I think it's the only place that you can purchase this book. It is an absolutely beautiful book, and Dr. MK wrote this a very long time ago, but it is still relevant today. And we can, you know, make sure that it's there. For everybody who was on the webinar today, thank you so much for your time and your insights. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate what the stories that you've told and what it means to you about having this First Nations education system and how important it is to you. And I know that's a really important thing to share, significant thing to share. Kathryn, such a beautiful story about Dr. MK, so thank you for sharing that as well. Appreciate that. We would, if you like the work that we're doing, please donate to Children's Ground. Please go onto our website. There is an opportunity to do that there. And we've also got a petition that we're going to government about when we go to Canberra in February. We want to be able to say to the politicians, this is what Australian people and First Nations people are asking of you. They want you to consider and advocate for a First Nations education system. It's not a small thing. It's a big change. It's a big systems change. And we're not saying that it's the only thing. We're saying it needs to be an option. It is our right to have a First Nations education system, and we have never had one. But it is an option and something that we're really keen to follow up on. So please go to our website. There's a link there to sign our petition. And yes, we'd really love you to be involved in that. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been on today's webinar. We know you're an advocate already. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for your time. I know you're all very busy people. And yes, I'll be in touch. Talk to you all soon. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.